What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be replacing a front axle on this F30 328i xDrive behind us. This is going to be the same process for any F22, F23 2 series, F30, F31 3 series, and F32, F33, and F36 4 series. It's a little bit involved, but we'll talk about some of those steps you're going to have to do while you're in there. Obviously, we'll be talking specifically about this spline drive interface and how to properly install that to make sure you don't strip out the end of the axle. But right now, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need for this job, and we'll go ahead and jump into it from there. So in order to replace the axle and the axle seal on the front of your F30 xDrive vehicle, you're going to need a 17mm socket for removing your wheels, a 17mm Allen for removing the axle bolt, a 13mm and 8mm socket for removing the reinforcement plate, and the splash shield. Removing the reinforcement plate is going to make it easier to remove the axle seal. Of course, you could get a work around that if you really needed to, but I don't know. I like it to be a little bit easier, so removing some extra fasteners is not a big deal. 21mm socket for torquing up the ball joint nut, you'll see why, and a T40 for counter holding the ball joint stud. 21mm sockets, really long one for leverage, and a standard one just for removing the ball joint nut, so you move the whole hub assembly out of the way. A pry bar, pretty much for popping out that axle seal. A variety of ratchets, both a short one for the counter hold on the ball joint stud and a long one for removing the axle bolt. A torque wrench capable of 210 newton meters, plus if it can do torque angle, that's also useful, but it's only 90 degrees. We'll talk about that a little bit later, so you couldn't get around with a standard breaker bar and a marker. Some hammers, a brass drift, and you'll want some kind of insulation tool for the axle seal. In this case, I'm just using some ball joint adapters out of a ball joint toolkit. It's the perfect size for installing that inner seal. Of course, you could get away with a larger socket, or if you wanted to, you could buy the BMW special tool if you really wanted that one, but something like this will work perfectly fine. Just need to be able to drive that seal in evenly. And of course, it helps to have some gloves and some light. So now that we've gone over the tools, let's go ahead and get right into it. So the first step with any DIY where you'd be working underneath the car, you want to make sure it's properly supported. Obviously in the shop, we have the luxury of the lift. If you're at home, you have to do this on jack stands, make sure the vehicle is level. Make sure it is safe underneath and it's not going to fall off those jack stands. So we also have to remove our set screw for the brake rotor, and we have to brake torque on this axle bolt right here. Easiest way to do that, you take a flathead screwdriver, shove it down the vanes of the rotor. Should give you enough to be able to counter hold the breakaway for that axle bolt. This right here is a 6mm Allen. These are known to corrode in place. If you have an issue, strip the hex out of that. You can go ahead and take a chisel and probably knock it out that way, or just drill a hole right through it. And depending on damaged threads on the hub, you can go ahead and put a new one in there. But if you do damage it, these little set screws only hold the rotor in place for assembly purposes. Technically don't need it. Just threw a lug bolt back in so I can basically the hub doesn't spin behind the rotor. You could leave the set screw in for that, but the set screw is pretty small and there's a lot of breakaway torque on this bolt. So rather just use a lug bolt instead. This is a 17mm hex or Allen. Next up, I'm going to take off the caliper carrier bolts. They're 18mm drive, and I have one of these caliper hooks just to hold on the caliper. I'm going to basically hang it on the strut. The pad wear sensor, I'm just going to unclip from that little tab there, so I have free rein in this thing. And I'm cheating with a swivel socket. You can obviously use a wrench and a ratchet for this. And then from here, we'll go ahead and remove the brake rotor. If your brake rotor is stuck to the hub because of corrosion, you can always tap it with a hammer here on the front. The vibration should break it free. So after we got the brake rotor off and the brake caliper and the axle bolt, we're going to be working from behind here now. What you want to do in order to get the axle out is you're going to undo the wishbone top nut and the tie rod nut, and what that's going to allow us to do is basically pivot the entire knuckle out of the way so we can knock the axle out from behind. These are 21mm nuts and a T40 counter hold. You are going to need to counter hold because the ball joint is not held in with a taper. There's a ball seat here, So you can't rely on basically the taper of the joint keeping it in place. I'll show you. And I mean, you can just see by removing that lower wishbone, you got a ton of room. In fact, I'm not even gonna remove the tie rod. You're supposed to by the book, but that was no problem at all. So to knock this axle out, I'm gonna use this brass drift and hit it from behind. There isn't really anywhere to pry on it, so this is kind of the only way. Here we go. Want to be careful. I mean, there's this plastic ring around it, but you're probably gonna break it. There's not really much area to touch. But like I said, brass drift was able to work here. On the axle on the other side, which kind of has a portion that goes through the oil pan all the way to the diff on the left-hand side, you could use an axle pop tool on this other side. You have a little bit more access than you do on the other. And this axle is really perfectly fine. Feel a little bit of play in the outer CV joint, but normally the mode of failure on these axles is the outer CV joint splits, grease goes everywhere, the CV joint basically gets contaminated, and you get a whole lot of play, and these things start making clicking sounds. More times than not, really difficult to rebuild these axles. Even if you reboot it, once dirt and water has gone in there, you're on borrowed time. So it's really best just to replace the axle. So next up, we're gonna go ahead and replace that inboard seal. Really should replace it anytime the axle is removed. You know, you could risk it and reinstall a new axle or the original axle without replacing that, but you do risk the potential for it to leak. So while it's apart, it does make sense to just replace it. That axle seal is in there pretty good. I'm gonna remove this reinforcement plate. It's just held on with 13mm bolts. I'm just trying to get a little bit of a better angle on it so I can pry it out of there. Gives me a little bit better angle to get this seal out. And a little bit of diff oil is gonna leak out, so just be prepared for that. So the new axle seal actually pops in somewhat into location. Just using this generic, it's a part of a ball joint press set, so nothing special. Just gonna slide it on over the edge. Want to make sure that inner lip seal is totally on the inside. And I'm just gonna use this as a seal driver, drive the rest of the way. And it'll basically just bottom out like that. Pretty simple. BMW does offer a special seal driver tool specifically for that seal, but was able to get by with generic tools just fine in this case. And that seal went in pretty easily, which is also nice. Next, I'm just gonna take a little bit of gear oil. We'll lubricate the inner lip of this seal. So when we slide the axle in, it doesn't grab or damage the new seal that we just installed. So next up, we're going to install the new axle. Note it does have a little snap ring on it. That's where you're actually fighting when you're removing it. So make sure it does have this retaining ring on it, because if it doesn't, the axle is gonna literally come back out at some point. So then it's just a matter of sliding it into position, getting it to line up, and then we're going to try to get it to pop in. So once I got the splines lined up on the axle with the diff, just use this dead blow hammer to get the snap ring past the little groove inside the differential there. Also, if you want to, you can just grab the axle. It should move back and forth a little bit, but it should not be moving. That's how you know it's in position and locked in place. So next up, we're just gonna push the new axle up behind the knuckle where it belongs. We're gonna take our lower wishbone here, and we gotta try to get this lined up again. Like so. We're gonna reinstall this control arm nut. It's 21mm, 6-point, and you're gonna need a T40 Torx to counterhold the ball joint stud. Torque spec on the ball joint nut is 175 Newton meters. Next, we just gotta get everything to line up. I'm kind of just threading in the axle bolt for now. And I'm feeling to make sure that the axle and those splines are engaged. So I'm twisting both the hub and the axle in different directions to make sure that those splines are definitely engaged, which they are. That's nowhere near where it needs to be torque-wise. But what I'm doing is, like I said, I'm making sure before I commit to torquing this that the axle and the wheel hub are engaged with each other. The only thing that keeps this together is that axle bolt. And if the splines are off a little bit, you're gonna have problems. A pretty good giveaway that you're lined up appropriately. This boot is just a little collapsed here. Is if you look at the back spacing between the axle and the wheel hub, it should be identical to the other side. So basically, the lip of the axle or the CV joint should be up against the back of the wheel hub and the knuckle, like so. That's really the only dead giveaway that you're in the correct position. We still need to torque this center bolt, but we're gonna do that after the brakes are back on. So we're gonna reinstall our rotor with the set screw. 6mm Allen, again, for that set screw. We'll slide the caliper back into place. 18mm. Torque spec on these caliper carrier bolts is 110 Newton meters. And lastly, we have to torque our axle bolt here. It's 210 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So in other words, a whole lot. So as you can see, replacing the axle on the front of your F30 xDrive car, not too bad. Fortunately, the design of the axle with that spline interface makes it very easy to get it out of the way behind the knuckle, unlike a traditional setup in which you might have to disassemble even more of the front suspension. So super nice design in that respect. Only thing you really want to be careful about when you're putting it back together is making sure that the splines on the axle mesh with the splines on the wheel hub. It doesn't hurt to check it a couple times. You just want to make sure that that axle is properly seated. Another thing to keep in mind too is in order to remove that axle on the left side, it does help if you have the reinforcement plate and the splash shield out of the way. Don't necessarily 100% need to do that, but it does open it up a little bit more for you, and especially removing that axle seal, having the reinforcement plate out of the way also gives you a much better angle to pop it out of there. But as you see, not that bad to replace the axle and the axle seal. Pretty straightforward, not really that many tools required, and it's definitely something you can do at home. And in the case of most of these xDrive cars, the front axle, the outer CV boots are going to split at some point. Spray the grease all over the place, and once that happens, it's not worth trying to reboot that axle. It's pretty much done at that point anyway, once water and dirt is allowed to get in that joint. So just better to go ahead and replace it and not have any problems. But other than that, hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. We'll get back to you. Hit that like button if you like this video, and also hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.